In April and May of 1964, two pretty incredible things happened on the Billboard Hot 100. In April, a new band called the Beatles took all of the 5 top chart positions. But then just a month later, a jazz musician in the later part of his career, Louis Armstrong, took that #1 spot from the Fab Four. This is the story of that moment in 1964. It's also a great chance for me to wax on about Louis Armstrong and what an important figure he was in the development of jazz in both the US and across the world. I'm going to assume you know who the Beatles are. The 4 boys from Liverpool were already playing for years at this point, but in 1964 the US was just learning about them, and in the height of Beatlemania they really couldn't get enough. Louis Armstrong was his own level of stardom and one of the most well-known entertainers in the world. But in the 21st century, outside jazz circles, he's really only known for one song that he recorded about 4 years before his death. So I'd like to spend a couple of minutes and remind you of Louis Armstrong's legacy. But before I go on, please subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. I make videos like this pretty much every week, and I'd love for you to see the next one. With that out of the way, my gross reduction of Louis Armstrong's biography comes in 3 parts. Louis Armstrong was born in 1901 in a New Orleans neighborhood known as the Battlefield. His father left pretty much as soon as he was born, and he had to quit school in grade 5 to start working. At age 11, he was arrested and sent to the Colored Waifs School for Boys. It was here that he received his first tuition in music, specifically playing the cornet, which is a kind of trumpet. After leaving the home, Armstrong kept working odd jobs, but started to focus on making a career in music. He received some early mentorship from Joe King Oliver before getting steady work on the Mississippi riverboats. In 1922, Armstrong left New Orleans to join King Oliver's band in Chicago, and the rest of the 20s Armstrong would spend between New York City and Chicago on various projects. The most important of these projects was Louis Armstrong's Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings. There were over 60 records made during this period where Louis Armstrong had his biggest impact on jazz, at least from a musical perspective. Until this point, jazz was really a collectively improvised dance music, but the Hot 5 and Hot 7 recordings really started to focus on the individual soloist, which was essentially the way that jazz would develop in the future. Armstrong headed back to New York City in 1929, and he took his first role on Broadway. This would be the first of dozens of appearances in film and on stage over the next couple of decades for Louis Armstrong. A few of his film credits would include Pennies from Heaven, High Society, The Glenn Miller Story, and Hello Dolly, which we'll talk about in a minute. Through most of the swing era, Louis Armstrong was also a very big radio star, and he started recording some of the really big popular songs of the time, including Blueberry Hill, La Vie en Rose, and Jeepers Creepers. Many of those were made under the name Louis Armstrong and his All-Stars. If you want to check out some great recordings of Louis Armstrong from this stage, I'd recommend the albums he did with Ella Fitzgerald. I'll leave a link in the description below. The other important part of Armstrong's career that I want to mention is his role as a jazz ambassador, both figuratively and literally. As the swing era drew to a close, Armstrong spent a lot of time touring in Europe, Asia, and Africa. Most of these were arranged by Louis Armstrong's own team, but later on, the US State Department got involved in this because they saw it as a good way to spread US culture and influence, especially in the thick of the Cold War. The Dave Brubeck Quartet was one of the first big acts to take part in this. In 1958, they embarked on a State Department-sponsored tour of Eastern Europe, Central and South Asia, as well as the Middle East. Artists like Dizzy Gillespie would later take part, and Louis Armstrong himself, in 1961, eventually toured Africa on the State Department's dime. There's a whole lot more to that story, and it's pretty complicated, so I'll save that for another video.
Now when the saints go marching in, now when the saints go marching in.
By the 1960s, Louis Armstrong's brand of jazz was well past its days of being on the cutting edge. Bebop had essentially come and gone, and styles like hard bop and cool jazz were becoming the modern dominant style. But it was at this stage in Armstrong's career, kind of as a throwback artist, that he would have his biggest commercial success. The song that took Armstrong to #1 was the title track of the musical Hello Dolly.
Hello, Dolly. This is Louis Dolly. Glad to have you back where you belong.
In previous decades, Broadway had supplied a ton of songs for essentially the popular canon, and beboppers like Dizzy Gillespie, Charlie Parker, and then of course Miles Davis and John Coltrane were responsible in taking a lot of those Broadway songs and adapting them to a jazz style, eventually making them what we know today as the jazz standards. Interestingly, the song Hello Dolly itself never really made it as a jazz standard. The jazz canon was really pretty much established by that point. As for the musical itself, it premiered in 1963, went to Broadway in 1964, and was an absolute smash hit. It won 10 Tonys, which was a record at the time. The only musical ever since to have won more Tony Awards was The Producers in 2001. The 1969 film adaptation starred Barbra Streisand and Louis Armstrong himself, and would go on to win 4 Academy Awards, including for Best Score. However, Armstrong's hit recording of the song Hello Dolly didn't come from a soundtrack album from either the film or the musical. It came from his own album, also titled Hello Dolly. Importantly, Hello Dolly was the first album that Armstrong had released for a couple of years, so there was a little pent-up demand.
You lookin' swell, Dolly. I can tell, Dolly. You keep going, you still going strong.
So back to the charts and back to the Beatles. As I mentioned, in April 1964, the Beatles took every single one of the top 5 places on the Hot 100, topped off with Can't Buy Me Love. Now in 1964, a song had to be released as a commercial single in order to be eligible for a place on the Hot 100. Today, with streaming counting towards the chart positions, there are regularly songs off the same album that all are on the charts at the same time. But for this to happen in the 60s, you would have had to release 5 separate physical singles of every single song. What happened with the Beatles was interesting though, because those 5 singles were released on 4 different record labels. Here are the 5 songs in their 5 chart positions with the record labels that released them. So how on earth did this happen? The short version is that the Beatles' UK label EMI wanted to release through Capitol Records, which was EMI's subsidiary in the US. But Capitol Records weren't interested. They saw the Beatles as kind of a naff throwback. So instead, EMI signed a series of distribution deals with smaller labels. Capitol eventually did release a couple of Beatles singles, and then once the Beatles finally blew up in early 1964, all 5 of these singles were available on the market, and all 5 appeared on the Hot 100 at the same time. Now, the Beatles had the top 5 locked down for just 1 week, but Can't Buy Me Love stayed at number 1 for another month until Louis Armstrong would knock it out of the top place with Hello Dolly on the 9th of May 1964. Interestingly, Hello Dolly would be Louis Armstrong's only number 1 in the US. Even What a Wonderful World, which was a UK number 1 in 1967, didn't enter the charts in the US until 20 years later. This is mostly because the head of ABC Records at the time didn't like the song, and so he didn't promote it. It was only in 1988, when What a Wonderful World was featured on the soundtrack to Good Morning Vietnam, did the song enter the Billboard Hot 100, eventually getting to number 32, and that was 17 years after Louis Armstrong had died. So Hello Dolly's outsized success really, more than anything, comes down to the fact that Louis Armstrong was just an incredible entertainer. Which brings me to my final point, which is that this moment was more than just a little quirk in chart history. The Beatles were an amazing group of entertainers, as much as they were great songwriters. Similarly, Louis Armstrong was an incredible entertainer, as much as he was a fantastic and important jazz musician. For an act to gain legitimacy in the eyes of both mainstream audiences as well as critics and other musicians is no small feat, but both the Beatles and Louis Armstrong pulled it off. So the 2 acts really share quite a lot in common. With that in mind, I would argue that the big musical upset of 1964 is not so much one musical world butting up against another. Instead, I see it as a kind of symbolic handing of the torch from one generation of popular music to another. Maybe that's all too sentimental and a bit soppy. Let me know what you think in the comments. As always, links to music and further reading are in the description. Please check them out if you want to learn more. Please subscribe and like this video if you enjoyed yourself, and I'll see you next time.